Welcome to our Think Big Series brought to you by PSG. My name is Sylvester Apisami, and I'm a financial advisor for PSG Wealth Employee Benefits, a division that focuses on both the retirement and healthcare provisions by employers to employees within businesses, both corporate and SMMEs. As a leading financial services group, PSG has an extensive national footprint in South Africa and a presence in Namibia. We've been in operation since 1998 and pride ourselves on providing a bigger picture approach to our clients' financial needs, from assets and wealth management, including employee benefits, to short-term insurance. We are an advice-led business backed by some of the best financial advisors around the country. The Think Big series is a collection of dialogues with high-value speakers hosted by award-winning financial journalist Bruce Whitfield. Each topic will address burning issues which are causing South Africans anxiety in these uncertain times. The series is aimed to empower our audience with factual evidence to formulate their own opinions and manage their expectations on how various aspects of the current situation could unfold. In today's webinar, Bruce talks to Professor Glenda Gray, who is the President and CEO of the South African Medical Research Council and the Chair of the Research Committee on COVID-19, bringing together scientific evidence and expertise to the Minister of Health and the National Coronavirus Command Council. She studied medicine and pediatrics at Wits University and is renowned for her research in HIV vaccines and interventions to prevent mother-to-child HIV transmission. Her work has received national and global recognition. Forbes named Professor Gray one of Africa's 50 most powerful women and Time as one of the world's 100 most influential people. In 2013, she was awarded South Africa's highest honor, the Order of Mapangawe. For those unfamiliar with this higher order, it is bestowed on recipients by the President for achievements in the international arena which have served South Africans' interests. You can follow the social media campaign via hashtag ThinkBigPSG. This series is free, shareable, and open to anyone interested, whether or not you're a client. Bruce, of course, needs little introduction. Over to you, Bruce.
Sylvester, thank you. Talk about the understatement of the year, things that are concerning South Africans. There's no greater concern right now, of course, than the COVID-19 crisis. We'd never really paid attention to anything called COVID. When it started, we knew nothing about it. Now we're all epidemiologists. We're all experts. We think we know what we're talking about. Luckily for us, we've got somebody who does know what she's talking about. Dr. Glenda Gray, great pleasure to have you with us on this discussion forum. I mean, this is what you were born for, I think. I mean, this is the sort of stuff where you understand the human tragedy and the consequences, and it's all awful for somebody in your profession to be living through a pandemic and to be at the forefront of advice and guidance and fighting off a pandemic really is quite exciting.
I think it's interesting that you say that. When the epidemic started, I thought, well, I'm going to catch up on writing my science articles and catch up on all the work that I had to do. And one of my colleagues phoned me and said, Glenda, this is the epidemic we've been waiting all our lives for. This is what we were trained for. This is our job. It's our job to respond. And I kind of thought, no, I'm going to sit this epidemic out. And he said, you know, this is what we've trained our whole life for. And I started to get involved, and I am so glad that I kind of threw my lot in. I think it's wonderful that the public is so engaged, and it's wonderful to see so many epidemiologists. I think the fact that our citizens of the country and policymakers, politicians, scientists, and the lay public all contributing, all engaged, all obsessing over the numbers and taking a keen interest on not only the issues around health, but also around livelihoods. The debate has never been so vibrant in South Africa over a healthcare issue and the public health issue. So for me, it's been a fascinating time because I've never seen so much engagement, so much civil engagement, and it's both a tragic time for that to happen, but at the same time, to see people, from all walks of life, navigating this epidemic, understanding the figures, trying to figure out ways to keep themselves safe, and to keep an eye on what's happening at a global level. So for me, it is a fascinating time, a time of both tragedy and opportunity.
I mean, we look at it and we understand so little about the virus, yet we understand its DNA footprint. I think that's what you call it. It's DNA markers. The Chinese were very quick to publish those in January this year when it became very clear that we had the threat of a pandemic. And it moved so quickly from January, when there were the first rumblings of this strange new virus that seemed to be emanating from China, and initially some suppression of information out of China, and then very quickly by February became a global emergency, and by March we had pandemic status, and then the world kicked in to fighting the virus in the only way we know how. And history becomes so important in this case, because we have a century of knowledge built up since the last big global pandemic, which was what they call the Spanish flu, but was actually an American flu, regardless of what Donald Trump wants to call the current one. But we've got this wonderful century of experience of dealing with a multiplicity of pandemics. What have you relied on to understand what we are going through right now?
I think, ironically, the same tools that we had then, we have now. So in fact, the tools that people used to keep the Spanish flu at bay are what we use now. So it's non-pharmaceutical interventions. It's masks. We see the wearing of masks, the issue around hand hygiene, and also social or physical distance. So those very robust tools have been the mainstay, in fact, of the way we approach this epidemic. At the same time, what's different to what happened during the Spanish flu is that there's a huge rush in the biomedical space to find solutions, antivirals, monoclonal antibodies, and vaccines. So what is different is maybe our ability to characterize the virus. Already we know what it looks like. We've already done the analysis of it. We can tell you, where this strain of the vaccine of the virus came from, the footprint. We're tracking it in our sewage, in our sewer system, and so there's a lot of basic science and fundamental science, as well as clinical applied science, that we can use to help us try and contain and manage this epidemic.
So, I mean, it's so interesting to me that every single picture you look at from the period of 1918 to 1920 has people wearing masks, has people in tents keeping their distance, has people sort of doing logical things that they had to learn from scratch because they didn't have an experience to draw on, certainly not a global experience. Why did it take us so long in the 21st century with our massive superiority complex to repeat the lessons of just over 100 years ago? We knew it was coming. We knew what we would need to do in case it did come, or when it did come. Yet there's still people around the world who think this is crackpot science, and it's not.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we could have done better with surveillance and maybe taken pandemic preparedness more seriously. It's hard to predict what the pathogen's going to be, and so it's hard to be ready with your biomedical interventions. But the same strategies you put into place immediately, and the most important thing is to characterize the virus. And so when we did hear about this unknown pneumonia, the pneumonia of an unnamed pneumonia that was causing a huge amount of death in China, we kind of thought it would be contained in Asia, and kind of watched from afar, and were completely surprised when we saw the spread into Europe and into the US. And this happened, it unfolded so rapidly. And so I think with global travel and a lack of appreciation about how actually contagious this virus was, left us really surprised. So I do think in terms of surveillance, understanding the interplay between climate change, zoonotic evolution, the movement of viruses from the animal host to humans, the interface between interacting with these exotic animals, and then exposure, and the rest is history.
What is the difference between COVID-19, this particular coronavirus, and the many multitude of coronaviruses that came before it, and the difference between SARS, which was an Asian virus, it largely stayed contained, and previous viruses, and I'm going to get all of the terminologies wrong, but we've seen outbreaks before which were scary, but didn't spread to the extent of COVID-19. COVID-19, as you say, surprised us by its speed and efficacy.
Yes, so coronavirus is normally a seasonal virus. It normally hangs around for 2 or 3 seasons, and it causes mild respiratory illnesses, and can be contained and doesn't cause a lot of mortality. And so this is a different kind of the structure. The way this virus has evolved is that there's part of the structure of the virus that made it much more contagious, and adjusted to be able to lodge onto our ACE2 receptors in our nasal epithelium and in our respiratory system. And so basically, the coronavirus uses our ACE2 receptors as the landing gear to land into our bodies and basically infect us. And so it's probably spent years evolving its landing gear, and this virus is equipped to basically land on a human on its ACE2 receptors and proliferate. And so we have a very contagious virus. It's incredibly contagious, and it's completely developed to attach to our receptors and proliferate in our bodies.
There are 2 aspects to that. I mean, one of the things is, and maybe one of the things that's contained previous viruses, is that they've been so deadly that the hosts have died quite quickly in some cases, and so there's been less chance to spread. COVID-19, while massively infectious, has been proven less fatal than perhaps we had feared initially, and therefore its carriers survive and therefore can perpetuate the virus, which is quite an interesting phenomenon with COVID-19. It's not devastating in the short term from a health system perspective, but its longevity is perhaps what is so dangerous.
Yeah, it's a vexing virus because on one level, for the young and the healthy, you have an asymptomatic, moderate, mild course. In fact, you might not even know that you have even had the virus. You go for a screen and you find out incidentally, and you think, oh, maybe 3 weeks ago I had a slight headache. And that's what's vexing. So on the one level, you have a mildly asymptomatic course for the majority of people, but then it unleashes its virulence in people with comorbidities and the elderly. And so you have this juxtaposition of a mild asymptomatic infection versus a deadly virus in the people that are susceptible, elderly and the comorbidities. And so this is what's different. It's not like it treats all its hosts the same. It seems to, so because of, the issue around the ACE2 receptors and the issue around the comorbidities that make us more susceptible, it really unleashes its stealth and its deadliness in the people that we need to protect. And that's what makes us managing this epidemic so difficult, because you don't want to cause deaths. And at the same time, you don't want to impact on your economy, and you're kind of balancing protecting the people who are vulnerable and then trying to keep society going on as normal. And it's very hard to do that because the young and the healthy will propagate it to the vulnerable, and how to try and stop that is itself a huge feat. And trying to manage a society where you keep some people apart and you allow other people to go forth is quite a difficult and tricky situation to do.
I mean, we've seen governments handle this in different ways, and we go into potentially dangerous territory and pull back whenever you're ready. But we've seen the response, for example, perhaps denial, perhaps bravado, perhaps ignorance, or whatever it was, in places like Brazil and the United States, and certainly for a time in the United Kingdom. Whereas countries that have generally, and I'm generalizing broadly here, countries that have been run by women generally seem to have weathered this better than others. And one of the theory goes that women's leadership style is, well, we don't give a damn about the economic consequences of the lockdown. We have to preserve life, so we lock down hard and immediately. And Germany has done particularly well with that. New Zealand has done well. Several of the Nordic countries did well on that sort of basis as well. And it's the model that South Africa followed too. Swift, hard lockdowns because we were already scared of the consequences for a health system in a time where we had no idea of the severity and all of the various unknowns at the time. What is your assessment broadly in which the way in which the globe has dealt with this in its multiplicity of approaches?
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue with South Africa, we are a low middle income country setting, and we don't have the kind of financial resilience of the Nordic countries or of Germany or even of the USA. And so these economies were devastated. And so going into the epidemic, we were well aware that China was facing economic devastation. We knew that Europe, Britain, and the US also were suffering. And obviously in Latin America, like South Africa, we're going to have the same kind of lack of resilience. And so at the same time, we have a fragile economy, and then you have this epidemic that's unfolding, and you're trying to navigate it. And as a woman and as a doctor and as I'm sure any politician, their first thought is to save lives, because they don't obviously want to see the mass graves that we saw in New York. And so there's a terrible desperation when you're faced with this epidemic and you don't know how it's going to unfold in your country. You know, we have HIV, we have TB, and we have a huge non-communicable disease epidemic and a very diverse demographic population. And so we had no idea at the beginning of the epidemic how it was going to unfold. The natural history of COVID-19 was not known in Africa. It's still really unknown. We know a little bit about it in North Africa, and we know a little bit about it in South Africa, but we don't even know how it's going to unfold in the rest of Africa. As we speak now, we're starting to see the COVID-19 epidemic start to take hold in the rest of Africa, and like South Africa, it's going to be devastating to the health system and devastating to the economies. And trying to preserve both, we all have fragile health systems, so it's very tricky. Even if we look in the US and we look at UK and look at their health system, which is much more robust than ours, you know, they buckled. And so I do think sometimes we have unrealistic expectations of what a low middle income country setting can do. And we already knew that we had a fragile economy coming into the epidemic, as well as a fragile health system. And so trying to it's like this tsunami that's coming, and you're in a little boat and you're trying to surf, or maybe you're a surfer and you're trying to, a beginner surfer, and you're trying to surf this big wave, and you're doing the best you can. You want to stay afloat, you don't want to be crushed, and you duck and you dive and you do what you can.
There's been a divide between the way in which government has treated science and the way it's treated politics and the way it's treated pressure groups. Certainly, I think it's indisputable that the initial lockdown was necessary. 3 weeks of lockdown gave us a little bit of time, bought us a little bit of leeway, perhaps even the 2-week extension. But the sort of blanket bans that government has placed on all kinds of activities, I get why it did it. It's easier to police everybody in the same way, or at least theoretically, than it is to have interest groups and try and get older people to isolate and younger people to go out and party, whatever the case might be. I mean, easy with hindsight, but could we have done it better?
It's hard to say. Maybe, you know, we could think back and say, okay, maybe we locked down at the time of a global scarcity of testing. So there were a couple of things that played into the way our epidemic rolled out in South Africa. And so already before we locked down, there was a global shortage of reagents to do the RT-PCR necessary for the diagnosis of COVID-19. And so there was a global shortage. Everybody was competing for these scarce reagents. At the same time, we locked down our international travel, which impeded the movement of equipment, from reagents to ventilators to other PPE into the country. So that had an effect that made it difficult to respond in the beginning. We were busy during the lockdown trying to get the National Health Laboratory Service to scale up testing, and they tried to do this even in the backdrop of little reagents. And so this was a country that was trying to sprint to the finishing line before we had learned to walk, essentially. And remarkably, the National Health Laboratory Service, for all its shortcoming, has amazingly rolled out public health testing, and very soon, in a matter of 10 weeks or so, was able to test as many tests as in the private sector. So it took a long time. It took a long time to scale up, but they were determined, and they were able to roll out testing and try and take on the testing capability. But it did take time, and maybe if hindsight's always 2020, maybe before you lock down a country, make sure that you've got all your reagents and all your equipment, and understand what banning international travel may do. And so I do think that the lockdown, I agree with you that the lockdown was critical. It helped slow down the epidemic, but at the same time, we were caught in a time trying to bring in reagents when there was a lockdown on international travel. So there were some unintended consequences of an early lockdown that was hard to maybe anticipate at the time of the lockdown.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's transpired the way it has. And as we're speaking, I mean, we've just seen a re-emergence of a handful of cases in New Zealand, Australia, reimposing lockdowns in places like Melbourne, for example, and this huge outrage by Australians about their lifestyles being impacted on, and they can't go out and have parties. But it's understanding the virulent nature of this thing, and the fact that it is a threat to health and to lives, and a threat to health systems. It does beg the question as to how long it lasts. And I mean, yes, pieces of string, we never know how long they are. When we look at 1918, perhaps there's a historical context. It came once, it dissipated. It came back a second time, it dissipated. It came back a third time, and then disappeared forever off the face of the earth. Is there anything in what we know about viruses and the way they behave that gives you any sort of indication as to patterns here for this one?
Yeah, well, I think that is our thinking initially, well, that this is going to last a season. And I think after seeing what happened in Wuhan, people thought, okay, the virus comes, it peaks, and then it goes. And what we saw, everybody was thinking, okay, there's going to be a peak, flatten the curve, and get over the peak, and you'll have a contained epidemic, and you'll have a contained number of infections. But this didn't happen. This is a contagious virus, and just as with the peaks came in the US, there was a resurgence of an even worse wave. The second wave was worse than the first wave. But there were differences in the United States because they never really implemented wearing masks in public. They didn't ban conferences, congresses, and social gatherings. And so there was a lack of appreciation of the importance of non-pharmaceutical interventions. And so their continued wave is unabated. They haven't really been able to contain the second part of the epidemic. I think it's going to be very hard to completely eradicate this virus without a vaccine. If you see what happens in New Zealand, in Belgium now, there's a lockdown again in Belgium, and in Australia, is that the moment the virus seeds into the community, you're going to have to try and contain it again. And so we're going to be doing this. We're going to be putting out felt fires all over the world until we have a vaccine. What happened with the Spanish flu? Obviously, there was the issue of herd immunity. So eventually, the immune response caught up, and there were enough people that had been exposed that could help with the people that were more vulnerable or weren't exposed. This virus is different. We know that it seems that the immune system wanes, and so maybe this is its evolutionary force. This is a smart virus. It has an evolutionary advantage. Its immune response seems to wane, so we might be protected for 6 months, 8 months, and even we don't know whether there's any long-lived memory T cells that can help us with the epidemic. With the virus, if we exposed it much later. But we are hearing reports of second infections, so which is very scary for us, and so that's why there is a difference between what happened with the Spanish flu and COVID-19. This is like the Spanish flu, is incredibly contagious, but also the immune system doesn't seem to be as long-lasting as we would have hoped, and so this whole thought of getting herd immunity is slowly making us feel uncomfortable that we might not be able to achieve that. And that is why there is this terrific race to find a global vaccine, because this seems to be the only thing we can use to put out the fire.
Let's talk about that vaccine and the race for it. There are 150 clinical trials or thereabouts, I think, around the world, serious ones anyway. And there is a race. It feels like an arms race. It feels a bit like the Cold War all over again. Just before we had this discussion, the Russians came out after 2 months of human testing and launched something they called Sputnik 5. If this isn't the middle finger up to the rest of the world and calling up all kinds of old conflicts and ego issues, I'm not sure what is. What's your, very early assessment of the progress that's being made, and especially with the bravado with which Vladimir Putin comes out and says, we got a vaccine?
I think you have to be careful. We need to know vaccine development takes years. And so I've been involved in HIV vaccine research, and it takes us 10 years before we ever see an effect or lack of effect. And what we've tried to do is concertina the clinical development of a COVID vaccine into months instead of years. And you do need to do a whole lot of clinical trials concurrently, as well as your preclinical development, to try and get to the phase where you're evaluating efficacy. But you need to do first of all, you need to do safety studies, and you need to know what the immune response is of your vaccine before you go into large-scale evaluation. And you need to have good animal data to show that it's safe and that at least there is some protection if you do a non-human primate challenge. But having said that, even if you do have a vaccine candidate and you kind of skip all the tests, you still have to enroll this vaccine in a randomized controlled trial, evaluate the vaccine against the placebo, and you need about 30,000 people and 140 endpoints to evaluate the difference between the vaccine and placebo. And without that data, without seeing that hard data, it's very hard to know how effective this vaccine is. You normally publish your data in peer-reviewed journals, and you usually show your data to your regulatory authorities, the FDA, SARPRA, and they look at your endpoints, they look at the vaccine design, and they say, yes, this vaccine is licensable. And it's all done in a very transparent way, because obviously, once a drug company applies for registration and a regulatory authority approves it, if something goes wrong, afterwards, the regulatory authority is also will have to answer, because it has to look after the public good. And so hopefully the Russian regulatory authorities have seen the data and are looking after the public good, because you can imagine in South Africa or in America, if the FDA or SARPRA had to approve a vaccine that was shown not to be effective or not to work, it would be a waste of resources and a waste of people's money to spend that much money on a vaccine. So it's very critical to know that the vaccine is effective, and we have to see that data. And without that data, you can't believe anything.
Okay, well, let's say we do get an effective vaccine. Somebody, a scientist, there's a person, and they've got their microscope, and they create the effective vaccine, and it goes through the processes. And everybody takes out their clipboards and ticks, and we accept that this is a good vaccine, it is a safe vaccine, it is one that we can use for global distribution. At that point, what happens? Because I mean, it strikes me that we've got 7.5 billion people who might need a dose.
We're going to need lots of vaccines to work, and we're going to need billions and billions of doses because we're going to need a global vaccine approach. And so I hope that many vaccines work, and that many pharmaceutical companies are, are able to produce these vaccines very rapidly. And so I do hope that everyone's going to be successful because we need billions and billions and billions of vaccines to help.
I mean, is there any talk at all in the scientific community of making it open source, for example? If one pharmaceutical company should get it, making it available so that we can get global immunity going on a large scale? History teaches us that the owners of the IP are very protective of their patents, and they like to profit from these patents. Is it different at all this time?
I think there's going to have to be global finance mechanisms, and they're going to have to be affordable for the poor. And so maybe you might find differential pricing, and you might find global financing schemes that will procure the vaccine on behalf of poor countries. I do think that there's going to have to be an interplay between mass scale up of production and the cost of these vaccines. And so someone's going to have to pay and finance the manufacturing, and we're going to need billions of doses, and we're going to need a bioreactors and a whole lot of processes that deliver safe vaccines that aren't contaminated in any way. And this all does require financing, global financing. It requires government financing as well as pharmaceutical financing. So hopefully there will be models where both the governments and the pharmaceutical companies work together. And we see this in the US. We see the BARDA Operation Warp Speed program working together with Big Pharma, and they've put outside billions of dollars to work with Big Pharma, bankrolling the development of vaccines, for Big Pharma, bankrolling Moderna, Pfizer, subsidizing AstraZeneca and J&J, all in that endeavor. So we've seen that countries will work with pharma to deliver that. And we've got to make sure that in South Africa, we also are working with Big Pharma and setting aside some resources to help with tech transfer, hopefully local development, and hopefully the ability to procure the vaccines that we're testing in the country.
Let's say, for argument's sake, we get a viable series of vaccines this year. By when is the world ready to travel, to connect, to go to a pub? I think a pub, that's maybe the thing that most viewers of this particular discussion are most interested in. But just to be able to go and get back to what we remember was fun.
This crystal ball.
Exactly, that's what I need. I need to polish it up really well.
Yeah, I'm a scientist. I'm not a clairvoyant.
but scientifically, if you get the scientific breakthrough, and you speed test stuff. I mean, the polio vaccine is probably the most recent, really successful antidote to a global pandemic. That took 4 years before the vaccine was able to be distributed. And I mean, I know a guy who's approaching 70 now, who was a little boy and lost a lot of the use of one of his legs in that pandemic. I mean, it's still very real. It's very visceral to us, and it feels impossible to think that in the 21st century we're going to go from finding a vaccine to 2 or 3 or 4 years of clinical testing, then to distribution, and it's 2026, and we're all much lighter and hungrier in a global economy that has fallen apart because we can't travel, we can't connect anymore. That doesn't feel like a viable option. It's not an option that we'll be satisfied with. So best case scenario.
We've got to. I mean, so I think what we have to believe is that by mid-2021, there are going to be 3 or 4 vaccines that have been found to be effective. And there'll be variable effectiveness, and obviously the variable effectiveness will affect the price. But even a moderately efficacious vaccine of 50% will make a huge difference. And maybe that will be the cheaper, the emergency vaccine. And so I do think that with the global endeavor having 4 or 5 pharmaceutical companies having vaccines, they will also create a fair competition. So when there are 4 or 5 companies that have a vaccine that works, the competition is fair because you're not the only one competing, so you're not the only one who sets your price. But I think that I always believe in global good, and that companies will increase production, global financing mechanisms together with local financing mechanisms will find the solution. We saw that with HIV, with the drugs. In the beginning, the drugs were astronomically expensive. We never ever thought we'd ever get treatment in Africa, and now you can get treatment for 300 Rand a month. And so magic does happen in science. And at the end of the day, I do think that health and human life matter at a global level, and the tragedy and destruction is not palatable at a global level for people looking out for prosperity and countries to flourish. So I do believe that that with 5 or 6 companies, even 3 companies having vaccines that have varying degrees of efficacy, there will be fair pricing and there will be distribution, because we don't have to compete with only one company who wants to only sell to one country.
So, I mean, it's at least a year, you suggest, before people watching this discussion are likely to have access to a dose of vaccine at an indeterminate price.
Yeah, it's at least a year. And in that year, what we have to do is we have to learn to live in this new normal. This is surreal. I mean, if you think back to early March, we were still having dinner, drinking wine, and meeting our families, and driving to different parts of the country, flying. And suddenly we walk around with masks, we don't see people, and we work from home. Who would have thought that would happen to us? And so we will get used to living like this, and we will learn to live in this life until we can go back into a country, into a society that is safer for us. And that is the tragedy of this epidemic, is that we're having to learn to live like we've never learned to live before. And hopefully using the non-pharmaceutical interventions, the physical distancing, wearing masks and washing our hands will help us, will be the stopgap until we find something that will allow us to go back into society.
I mean, never again do we laugh at people wearing masks on aeroplanes and going, what on earth are they doing? Just for example, I mean, just the drop-off in influenza this year is nothing short of extraordinary, because it shows us that the measures that we're taking are very effective in stopping the transmission of things we're used to. And so therefore, there is no debate or dispute that keeping ourselves distant from others provides the best level of protection against this particular virus. We worry that each round of virus as it comes and as it evolves, because viruses are nasty little sods, aren't they? I mean, you understand them better than most, but they evolve and they morph and they change and they find new ways of getting into our faces. How do you lie awake at night? Do you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning in a cold sweat, worrying about this virus? Have you given it a name? I don't know. How do you, as somebody who understands it better than us, deal with it?
I do. I wake up in a cold sweat often, and a huge dread fills me when I look at the figures of the global figures, and I think, like, how can it be that over 20 million people have been infected since December 2019? How can it be that more than 750,000 people have lost their lives? You know, what happened to the world? And so we have to be prepared. So this is a good wake-up call for us. You know, we have to be prepared. We have to be prepared for future pandemics. We have to understand global warming. We have to understand the issues of zoonotic evolution, of viruses evolving from jumping the species barrier. We have to be more vigilant. we have to understand, how humans interact in the environment and be much more mindful of our place on this planet. So yes, they are sods, those viruses, and so are humans. We're both sods, and so we have to learn, to watch out for that other sod, if we want to survive.
Give me a sense, the level of disruption with kids in school, for example, and we've just had the academic year so severely disrupted. We've had Adam Habib on this on the series as well, talking about how quickly university managed to evolve and change, but basic education has been very, very slow in addressing. And while some private schools are operating, government schools by and large have been closed for much of this year. Huge detriment to future generations of young people. In this environment, advice as to how we go back safely, how we actually manage a return to give kids a future. That surely has got to be a major consideration.
This is the biggest tragedy of the COVID epidemic, because children are collateral damage in this epidemic. They're normally asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic, and very few children succumb or die from this disease. However, people are worried about them transmitting to adults, and people are worried about, they're worried about their children. So even though the data shows that kids are largely spared, it doesn't help a parent when they take their child to school. And so I think one of the biggest tragedies is the fact that our children aren't going to school, and that we haven't managed to develop a system that gives confidence to the teacher and to the student and to the parents about safely navigating this space called school. And we need we need heroes we need hero teachers, and we need hero parents, and we need a system that understands that we have to get our children back to school. The only ticket out of poverty and out of joblessness is an education, and we knowing that these children will benefit from school, we're knowing that they'll get food, and if we can find ways of keeping classrooms safe, there are lots of ways. Keep the old teachers and the ones with comorbidities out of the classroom, put the young teachers in the classroom, do alternate day teaching, do teaching classes in the morning, classes in the afternoon. Find a solution, find a way to keep those kids at school and to keep the system going. We can't let education grind to a halt, and we have to, like we had to do with the Home Affairs offices. They had to open. People had to register their births. They had to register their deaths. They had to get their registration cards, their ID cards. Those offices had to open, and they had to work. And in the same way, our schools have to work. We have to find a way of managing expectations, understanding the risk, but keeping those doors open, keeping the doors of education open. Be brave about making sure that we take kids back to school and we try and protect them the best we can.
My heart is sort of going at twice the rate it was before that answer, and it is, because it is about measuring risk and saying, what are the consequences of the actions that we take, because the decisions we make today have long-term consequences across so many spheres. Do we believe the data? And I ask this question very seriously based on the fact that actually, based on our fear at the beginning of the pandemic versus the reality, our death rate, while one of the highest in the world per 100,000 people, is mercifully low compared to what we might have anticipated it could be. But what we've got, and if we look at all the data of unusual deaths, or deaths that aren't measured or don't have a reason ascribed to them, we've got quite a higher number of deaths for the year so far relative to previous years. And it does suggest that lots of these cases are slipping past the bean counters, the data gatherers, and that perhaps some mortality rates are worse than we officially acknowledged.
We do have excess deaths at this time. So the Medical Research Council has been tracking deaths for decades. So we have this group that has tracks death, which normally is not that people don't really look. So every week, for years and years, we dutifully publish our deaths for the last week. And we have been tracking deaths over the last 30 years, and we have seen excess deaths happening since the start of the epidemic. We've been tracking it. And we've seen our natural deaths also go down because of the prohibition on alcohol and the lockdown. But we do see excess deaths, and we're seeing a turn at the moment, so that's good. So we have seen deaths more than have been reported by the minister related to COVID-19. But we do think that it's a combination of deaths. We do believe that some of them are COVID related, and these people died home without knowing that they have got COVID, or before they get to the hospital. There are a group of people that are probably too scared to go to the hospital and may die from non-COVID diseases like HIV, TB, or other kind of ailments. And so I think it's a combination. There is COVID-specific deaths and collateral deaths, but every death in a pandemic must be counted because that's arisen because of the epidemic, and some of it's because of the COVID, and some of it's because of our health system that's been reorientated. And so every death needs to be tracked, and this will help us understand the broader impact of COVID on our health system as well as on our population.
Going full circle, back to Glenda Gray, as somebody who has been the face of the fight, and you got yourself into trouble once or twice by speaking your mind. But this is, as you said, your colleague called you up and said, this is the thing we've been waiting for all our lives. It's the thing we've been training for all our lives. You see that finally science regains its status as one of the most important professions in the world. I mean, for so many years, we've been frankly more interested in the Kardashians than we have been about the scientists and facts. And suddenly facts and science and the real world skills have started to matter again. And that's got to be quite gratifying for somebody who perhaps has maybe felt a bit marginalized from the mainstream for a while.
Yeah, science is important because science brings evidence to what matters, and we've always used science to change policies. So, we showed that HIV was causing AIDS during AIDS denialism just by counting mortality, and that showed the government that there was an AIDS epidemic. And we've also shown over time that drugs treat and prolong HIV, and giving drugs is important. So that's all evidence. And so this is also important, the work that we do now, because it's showing that interventions, looking at interventions to minimize COVID mortality in hospitals, interventions to look at monoclonals, and interventions to try and find vaccines. So it's important. Science always needs to respond appropriately to crisis and to a health crisis. And it's very gratifying to see health respond. It's gratifying to see the citizens of our country engaging with scientists, asking the very questions and demanding answers and questioning what science says, questioning the models. It's beautiful. It's beautiful to have people questioning our models, our assumptions, and saying, I think you got it wrong. I think this is the debate, the dialogue is that science is not sacred, and science should be attainable and should be debatable by all.
How much does the social media world concern you in terms of misinformation, the ability to manipulate information, the ability to deliberately distract attention away from what is scientifically proven and important, and basic health and basic safety, and some of the more loony debates in this space?
I have been surprised at the nefarious agenda, oftentimes, of media and of interest groups. And have been caught off guard sometimes by the agendas of certain sectors. And so it's always disappointing to realize that everyone has an agenda, and so you always have to be careful as a scientist, because you can sometimes find yourself when you're trying to be quite transparent, you might find yourself either on the right side or the wrong side of a sector. And certainly with the alcohol ban, the MRC had to tread very carefully between to always show the science and to show what we were seeing, and not get caught up, try not get caught up in the debate about whether what happened in the country was right or wrong. We provided the data that a curfew and alcohol prohibition did decrease the rate of unnatural deaths in the country, and by applying that, the MRC also found itself in a situation where we were at the, people weren't very happy with us from other sectors of society.
Do you think that governments and politicians generally have treated scientists and the science and the evidence with the reverence with which it should have been treated?
I do think that there's a great respect for science and evidence. And what I have seen, both in our country and in other parts of the world, is that I guess there are a lot of factors that play into a decision that you make. And so sometimes science plays 75% into your decision, and sometimes it plays 25%. And sometimes it's disregarded completely, as you may have other stakeholders or other sectors to satisfy. And so I think while we as scientists always want the decision to be made based on the evidence that we see, we also need to understand that at many times governments have other competing interests and pressure on them that they need to take into account when they make their decisions. And so unfortunately, not all decisions, it appears, will always be science-based, but a lot of the times decisions are science-based. And so I guess we can't have it all the time, but at least I do think that both in South Africa and at a global level, people are attentive to science and are trying to base their decisions as much as possible on science, but that always doesn't happen.
What's going to make you sleep well at night again? At what point do you see yourself going, okay, it's fine to go to sleep and have 8 hours of unbroken slumber?
Knowing when you go to work, or knowing when your elderly parent goes to the shop, knowing that they're not going to be susceptible to a deadly infection. So knowing that we licked this pandemic, knowing that we saw it and we curtailed it and we controlled it, that'll make me sleep again. Knowing that we're going back to normal and that this terrible nightmare of an epidemic is over will make me sleep better.
Glenda Gray, thank you very, very much indeed. Dr. Glenda Gray, one of South Africa's leading epidemiologists. Big word, and we've even, over the last 6 months, learned to say it properly. Epidemiologist. Not that hard. Sylvester, back to you.
Thank you, Bruce. And Glenda, thank you for sharing your personal journey in the fight against COVID-19. Glenda has a reputation for integrity and fearlessness, and this came across in our webinar today. We appreciate your insights on the economic impact on job losses, COVID-19 transmission within the youth, and the impact on the education system. Thank you for sharing the importance of the vaccine to combat, as you mentioned, the smart virus, and we look forward to the magic of science. Our clients are exposed to the noise of the COVID statistical data precipitation and the emotional roller coaster that has come with these times. This creates uncertainty about investment decisions, when to act, where to invest, and how to plan for the future. All in all, making decisions has become much more difficult. We all work hard for our money, but emotions can blur objective decision-making about your financial portfolio. This takes me to the value of good, untainted, and objective financial advice. In my opinion, PSG has the best network of financial advisors, both wealth and insure, a network that has been built up over many years. Through their expertise, our financial advisors add a layer of certainty to your decision-making. If you already have a PSG advisor, I encourage you to engage with them. They are equipped to advise you on your financial and your insurance portfolio. And if you don't, then please get in touch with us via our events registration platform. We welcome your feedback. Please communicate with us. Look out for our next speaker in the PSG Think Big Series. We'll be talking to Leela Fourie on the future of local and global financial markets, and we'll talk to Estienne de Klerk on the status of the commercial property market. Thank you for your time and stay safe.